Hello everyone and welcome back to the Ryan Retro channel. In today's video we're going to do a huge Game Hub Windows gaming shootout between the Snapdragon 865, the Snapdragon G2 Gen 2, the Snapdragon G2 Gen 3, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, the Snapdragon 8 Elite, and my LCD Steam Deck. The Steam Deck's basically here just as a baseline, and for the just get a Steam Deck bro crowd, it's not really part of the shootout because it should pretty easily beat everything on the table. It's more here just to see what you could get if you go for the native option. If you go for the thing that you can buy easily in a store, pick up, install your games, and play simply, versus all the kind of tinkering we need to do over here to get something smaller and lighter. So let's talk about the testing conditions, what's different between the devices, and how I've got them set up for this test. First of all, let's talk the discrepancies. The Snapdragon 865, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, and the Snapdragon G2 Gen 2 devices all have 8GB of RAM. The Snapdragon G3 Gen 3 and the Snapdragon 8 Elite have 12GB of RAM, which should help in these tests. I'm using the latest version of Game Hub, which at the time of filming is version 5.3.3 on all of the Android devices. When it comes to the game settings, I've gone into compatibility and I've changed the translation parameters to extreme and then toggled on this TSO enabled TSO memory checkbox. I find this gives me a really good starting point in any game. I've then also chosen the latest driver, so for all of the devices except for the Elite that support turnip drivers, that is turnip 26.0.0 revision 4 at the time of filming, and for the Elite I've chosen the latest Qualcomm driver 842.13. There is also version 849.0 as well, but I found that these don't make too much of a difference. I've just gone for whatever's at the top of the list. For all of the handhelds, I've also chosen the latest DXVK version, which is 2.7.11 async, and the latest VKD3D version, which is VKD3D Proton 3.0A. I've also chosen the latest CPU translator, which for most games is the FEX 2025-1120, and for some games is the Box 64 preset, and I've once again chosen the top available option, which means the newest and latest one. So with those 5 changes on these 5 handhelds throughout 12 games, I've already made 300 changes before I've even launched a single game. And while there might be better specific settings for specific games, which you can find on my website ryanretro.com or on emuready.com, I've already made more than 300 changes just to start filming this video, and I don't have time to make any more. So the only thing I'm going to do in this video is if a game just simply doesn't load whatsoever, I will come into the translation parameters and move down to one of the more stable ones. Generally, the further left you are on this list, the better performance you're going to get, but the further right you go on this list, the more stable the game will be. So if a game doesn't load whatsoever, I will change from extreme to performance. If it still doesn't load, I'll change to stable. If it still doesn't load, I'll change to compatible or game preset. And if I cannot get it to load whatsoever, I will of course let you know. But this is the only thing I'm willing to change in this video, or I'll be here forever and this video will just never get made. Every Android device is using the same SanDisk Extreme SD card, except for my phone, which doesn't have an SD card slot, so it's using the internal memory, and they will all be set to their most powerful modes. All of these devices have internal coolers except for my phone, which puts it at an obvious disadvantage. So I am going to attach this ice cold cooler on the back, which isn't as good as a full fan blowing through the device like these have, but it's the best I can work with today. Snapdragon 8 Elite devices are not available to the general public yet. Some reviewers did get their hands on them, but I sadly wasn't chosen. Thanks to a few kind people I spoke to throughout the last week, I've set up a Throne, which is a website where you can support creators like me who can't afford the latest greatest things they want to review, and you can help crowdfund them if you'd like to. I set it up and I didn't expect anybody to actually give me any money. I thought I would just do it to see what happens, and I've already raised more than 50% of the money. So if you'd like to see me make more videos like this in the future, but with a dedicated Snapdragon 8 Elite device, the Odin 3, please consider contributing to that crowdfunding platform. Now, if you don't want to, absolutely no worries, of course, no pressure whatsoever, that's fine. I just thought I would put it it out there in case anybody wants to help. And also thank you so much to the people who have helped so far. So that's how the Android devices are set up. The Steam Deck, I've not really gone too deep into the settings of anything. Partially because I ran out of time after already changing 300 settings for these, but also because it's kind of the beauty of the Steam Deck. You just download something and start playing it. Of course, if you do want to tinker with it, you can go nuts with it. But I think the main selling point of the Steam Deck is you just install a game and play, and it mostly runs pretty nicely. So we're going to see what the Steam Deck experience is like over tinkering with something like this as we jump into this shootout. And I've got a mix of games from ones that should be easy and get hundreds of frames per second to ones that are really going to push these devices to their limits. One thing to take note of in this test is don't pay any attention to the temperature readings in GameHub. They are completely wrong. The G2 Gen 2 here says that it's running at about 90 to 95 degrees no matter what you're doing on it, when it's clearly not. And at the other extreme, the G3 Gen 3 always says it's running at around 3 degrees Celsius, which I can also assure you it is definitely not. So don't pay any attention to these temperature readings in GameHub. They are completely inaccurate. So without any further ado, let's jump into the first game, which will be Cuphead. Interestingly, right away, I can't seem to get it to load on the 8 Gen 2, which is really weird because I'm sure it does work on here usually. So I am making my way down the translation parameters to something more stable, but you know, this is the nature of the test. Maybe with some more tinkering it would work, and in other occasions it might work, but we have a lot to get through here, so I can't just sit there all day long. Let's jump into the ones that are working and see what kind of performance we're getting. When I get into a game, they're likely going to be locked at 60 frames per second. That's because GameHub usually puts a 60 frame per second limit on games. So in order to get rid of that and really showcase and benchmark the performance here, what we're going to do is swipe from the side of the screen to bring up the GameHub menu, come down to the second option, which is performance, and we're going to turn off enable frame limit. We're also going to turn on native rendering plus, which should help with input lag and make everything feel more responsive. So right when I do that, you can see my frame per second shot up to 236 frames per second here. Running around, jumping and shooting, the frame per second now is around 180. And before I got smashed up by mushrooms, it was settling into around 165 to 180. So let's say about 175 for that one. The earlier Retroid Pocket 5 we'd assume would get less frames per second, and we're starting out around 160, falling down to around 150. So once again, well above the 60 frame per second limit of the screen, so absolutely lovely here. And as it drops, it's dropping to around 120 or 130. So about 130 there. The Odin 2 Portal unfortunately just cannot run this game at the moment. I'm sure there is a workaround for that, but as I said before, when we've already changed 300 settings, I'm going to have to try to fix that another time. Next up, we have the Konkr Pocket Fit with its G3 Gen 3 processor. This one absolutely annihilated the Switch test last time, and here we have well over 300 frames per second. Again, it is dropping as the level goes along. It started out around 500, it's now in the high 200s, fluctuating sometimes down to 250, up to 350. I would say it was mostly around 280. Next up, we have the Snapdragon 8 Elite in my phone, and we're getting around 140 frames per second. Now, a more dedicated gaming device with the Snapdragon 8 Elite can do very well in this test. So yeah, we got around 140 frames per second there. Interestingly, the Steam Deck seems to be stuck at 60 frames per second. I've gone into the game settings and I've disabled VSync. I've also brought up the side panel, disabled frame limit, allowed tearing, and all kinds of other things. But we just seem to be stuck at 60 frames per second here. Now, if you check out the frame graph, you can see it's an extremely smooth 60 frames per second, which makes it feel super buttery and lovely. And really that is the benefit of the Steam Deck. Most games just feel very smooth. And if a game is only able to attain maybe 40 frames per second, you can actually lower the refresh rate of the screen to 40 frames per second, and it will look beautifully smooth. Some games need certain fixes to unlock the frame rate, which may be needed there in Cuphead. Let's now move on to another game that should get a really nice frame rate, Hollow Knight Silksong. Once again, my Odin 2 Portal just doesn't want to load the game. I'm not really sure what's happening here. If this keeps happening, I might have to do a separate test of this off screen and then add the results of this to the table later. It should be similar to this anyway if they're a similar chipset, but I really hope we can get this working. Here in Hollow Knight Silksong, the Snapdragon 865 device, the Retroid Pocket 5, has somewhere in the high 70s for frames per second. I would say overall we're getting around 80 frames per second here. So more than enough to max out the 60 Hz screen, though sometimes dropping into the 70s, but it should be a pretty nice experience overall. The Retroid Pocket G2 on the other hand is getting around 120 frames per second. The frame rate is pretty steady, somewhere in the mid 120s, falling down to a low of around 110, so a good 30 to 40 frames per second boost here. The Snapdragon 8 Elite's getting more here, around 130 to 140 frames per second, averaging out also somewhere in the 120s, but I do feel my phone already getting quite hot, so a dedicated handheld definitely should do quite a bit better than this. This is just simply the best I have to work with because I don't have a Snapdragon 8 Elite device. The G3 Gen 3 here and the Konkr Pocket Fit is getting over 200 frames per second. And here where all of the others dropped frames, we're dropping around the mid 180s. Averaging overall about 190 frames per second. And for those who say just get a Steam Deck, here the Steam Deck's getting around 250 frames per second. Falling to around 240, occasionally climbing up to around 260. A very solid performer here, especially when you consider with the Steam Deck, I haven't actually changed anything. I've just installed the game and I'm just playing it. Next up is a super cute game, Monster Boy and the Cursed Kingdom. This one always gets so many comments when I show it in my videos asking what it is, and a great one to try to get a high frame rate in. So let's begin once again with what is the weakest system on the table, which is the Retroid Pocket 5 and its Snapdragon 865. Here the frame rate's about 120 frames per second, maybe around 125. Definitely a nice solid experience. Falling down a little bit as we get further through the level, but a nice solid experience. And I'd say overall it's actually around 115 frames per second. The Odin 2 Portal is now finally playing a game for the first time in this video. And we're getting a much better performance than the Retroid Pocket 5. It also looks much smoother thanks to the Odin 2 Portal's 120Hz screen. Unfortunately, YouTube doesn't allow uploading at 120 frames per second, but I can assure you it looks buttery smooth with that lovely refresh rate. Overall, it seems like we're getting around 160 frames per second. The G2 Gen 2 here isn't really doing quite as well as I hoped. It's getting around 100 frames per second. Certainly not doing the best here. And even falling down into the 80s, much less than the 8 Gen 2 of the Odin 2 Portal. Once again, it should be noted that this only has a 60Hz refresh rate screen anyway, so anything above 60 won't really be utilized, but it will be interesting to see how it does when we get into the more demanding games later in this video. If you haven't figured it out yet, we're getting more demanding as we go along. The Konkr Pocket Fit with its G3 Gen 3 processor is getting around 170 frames per second here, falling down to around the 160s, jumping up to around 180, very similar to the Odin 2 Portal in this game. It seems that in this game they're pretty much neck and neck. The Konkr Pocket Fit has a 144Hz screen, so is even smoother than the Odin 2 Portal. Although I will admit I can't really tell the difference between 120 and 144Hz. So overall, it seems like the frame rate here is around 165. The Snapdragon 8 Elite, again struggling with the heat, is going anywhere from about 80 frames per second to 120. I really wish I had a dedicated handheld to show you here, but the good news is we have compatibility. When it comes to Switch gaming on the Snapdragon 8 Elite, some games just won't even launch. Thankfully, when it comes to Windows games in GameHub, we shouldn't have those kind of compatibility problems, and you should be able to play a lot of games here. At what seems to be around 120 frames per second for this game. The Steam Deck again feels super smooth and is running at around 270 frames per second, falling down to around 230 or 240, let's say an average of around 250 frames per second for the Steam Deck. Once again, a super nice performer. And a little game like this is never going to stress out the Steam Deck. We're even up to 280 frames per second now. The Steam Deck is just a super nice handheld. Our next game is Megabonk, and this time two of our devices didn't work. The Portal has once again just completely crashed out. If you have an Odin 2, an Odin 2 Mini, a Portal, an AYN Thor, any of those devices that use this 8 Gen 2 processor, please let me know what kind of settings you're using to get games working, because I know these games can work, it's just really a shame they didn't work today. The Retroid Pocket 5 also just gives me a black screen in this game, so I'll try lowering the translation parameter from extreme down to a more compatible one. For now, let's check out the ones that did work. First of all, we have the Snapdragon 8 Elite, which again is showing its compatibility with Windows games. It's running pretty much all of them. I fear Megabonk is going to be quite tricky with on-screen controls, but just looking at the frame rate, we're getting somewhere around 40 frames per second. dropping down to the mid-30s. It's mostly at around 40. So if we were to put a 40 frame per second lock on this, it would probably actually look pretty good. It definitely seems like a high 30s to 40 frame per second game on the Elite that I have right now. Very similar story here on the Retroid Pocket G2. We have around 40 to 45 frames per second. Feels a little bit smoother, but that might just be because I'm using a controller and not on-screen controls, which always helps. But overall, yes, around 45 frames per second. The FPS in this game seems to be really solid, at least until we spawn bosses, I assume. Maybe when there's a much bigger swarm in the level, it will fall down a little bit, but this is a game I would expect to run pretty well. And in fact, I have completed a few levels of this on the Konkr Pocket Fit, so you definitely can play this on these Android devices. And here on the Konkr Pocket Fit, we're getting quite a fluctuating frame rate from around 68 frames per second, jumping up to around the high 70s. The other devices were pretty much a 40 frames per second experience. This is around a 60 to 75 frame per second experience. I would say the average frame rate here would be somewhere around 68 frames per second. Overall, a pretty nice experience. And with the Android devices getting somewhere between 40 and 68 frames per second, the Steam Deck's getting around 240. So once again, you really see why people say, just get a Steam Deck, bro. Especially considering that the Steam Deck is actually about the same price or even cheaper as some of the upcoming Snapdragon 8 Elite handhelds on the market. So if you do just care about getting your frames, playing your games simply, the Steam Deck really is the way to go. It's quite big and bulky compared to the others, but it's just such a solid handheld. Our next game is Hades 2, and we got an error message here on the portal which might help us diagnose what's wrong. It says there is an error with the VKD3D instance get VK instance. So I tried to change the VKD3D version to a few different options, but we still have this same error. So unfortunately, we're having a lot of problems with the Odin 2 portal today, which I did not expect. I'm also letting my phone cool down a little bit like this in between tests, as it doesn't have that active inside cooling. So let's jump into Hades 2 now and see what kind of results we're getting, beginning with the Snapdragon 865 device. As we zoom around, we seem to be getting around 65 to 70 frames per second. Let's just smash some baddies. And yeah, the frame rate's pretty solid, around 65. With some more bad guys on the screen, it's dropping down to around 50 now, but it certainly feels pretty smooth. When lots of things are happening on the screen, I would say the frame rate's around 51. So let's see what improvements we get with the G2 Gen 2, basically the upgraded version of the Retroid Pocket 5. And here the frame rate is around 64 frames per second with lots of things going on. With less things going on, we're getting around 75. But in the same scenario as the Retroid Pocket 5, where that had around 51 frames per second, here is around 67. So nicely above 60 frames per second this time around. The G3 Gen 3 is at around 120 frames per second, getting up above 140 when not many things are happening, so really making use of that refresh rate of the screen. But when more things are happening on the screen, the frame rate is in the 120s or 130s. I would say the average frame rate here is about 124. Similarly, the Snapdragon 8 Elite is getting around 130 to 140 frames per second when not much is happening, but falling all the way down into the 80s or 90s when more is on the screen. I expect this may be partially due to the heating situation. So I would love to see the results of people who have dedicated Snapdragon 8 Elite handhelds to see what kind of frame rate they're getting. Here the frame rate is really fluctuating. I would say overall it's around 105 frames per second. My Steam Deck now has low battery, so you're going to see one of the reasons why the Steam Deck isn't the best device to take out on the go with you. But here, once again, the frame rate is higher, around 220 when not much is happening on the screen, dropping down now to around 125 with a lot going on. So actually not too dissimilar to some of our much smaller handhelds. I would say overall, the frame rate is somewhere around 150. Next up, we have Traveler's Rest, a game that is really deceptively hard to run. When you look at the art style and the fact that it's quite a small game that I think is not even completely finished yet, you might think it would be really easy to run a game that looks like this compared to a big 3D game with all different angles and things going on. But I guess this game is just horribly optimized because it's extremely difficult to get a good frame rate on this, on anything. It's hard to even run it in the first place. This is the first game so far in the video that I've had to turn all of these translation parameters down from extreme to performance, or the game just completely crashes. It does seem that we do actually have the game loaded on the Odin 2 portal over here, which is great news, although our overlay does seem to have gone out to get a hot dog. Okay, I seem to have managed to toggle the overlay back on, but it says 0 frames per second. So we're going to see how the others feel, and I'll try to guess what frame per second this is at based on the others. The Retroid Pocket 5 unfortunately just isn't able to even load into this game, no matter what I do, changing down the translation parameters from extreme to performance to stable, I just can't get into the game today. The Retroid Pocket G2, I'm happy to say, does let me get into the game and gets a frame rate somewhere around 40 frames per second. So a nice improvement here over the Retroid Pocket 5. It's not the most perfect performance ever, but we are into the game and it's running okay. And you can also see the frame chart is very steady as well. So a super solid 40 frames per second here. Not too shabby. The Snapdragon 8 Elite is also hovering at an exact 40 frames per second as well. So I started to wonder if there's some kind of 40 frames per second VSync turned on, but there is not. It just seems to be running at basically the same frame rate as the G2 right now. So both of them pretty much at 40 frames per second. The G3 Gen 3 here is running at about 50 frames per second. Yet again, a pretty nice smooth frame graph here, so we're not really losing too many frames. It's running pretty smoothly at around 49 or 50 frames per second. So certainly not too bad. Just a few months ago, we were barely able to get even 10 frames per second in this game. GameHub really has come a long way over the past few months. With the frame chart here completely broken, just feeling how it feels in comparison to the others, this does feel once again around 40 frames per second, just like the others were. Perhaps a little bit less. I'm going to say this feels like about 30 frames per second, but I'm not going to give it an official score in the chart because we simply just don't know. And then the Steam Deck, which I had to plug into a battery because it was running out, is getting around 78 frames per second. So once again, a noted improvement over the other devices, but a noticeably worse battery. Now I will say the other devices were charged to around 100% before starting this video, and the Steam Deck was at about 60 or so, but it is certainly losing battery much quicker than the other devices. Next up we have Tomb Raider, and interestingly, the Snapdragon 8 Elite is the only one that actually loaded into the game. The others just crashed no matter what settings I used. So let's run the benchmark of the Snapdragon 8 Elite versus the Steam Deck for Tomb Raider. Okay, the benchmark has finished and you can see the average FPS of the Steam Deck is 148.5 and the average of the Elite is 87.6. Certainly not too bad whatsoever. We did have a minimum FPS of 1.4 on the Elite, but that's likely more to do with my Frankenstein cooler slapped on the back of a folding phone experimental GameHub device, and I'm sure, or at least hopeful, that a dedicated Elite handheld will get a much better minimum frame per second readout than this. But if we were able to play this game with an average frame rate of 87 frames per second, that would be a lovely experience, so a good result here for the Elite in my opinion. Next up we have Grand Theft Auto 5, and unfortunately I wasn't able to get into the game on the Elite this time. No matter what I tried, it just wasn't loading. Again, I'm sure I can get into it, I have in the past before, but you know how it goes, as soon as you try and show somebody something on camera, it just doesn't work anymore. So let's put this to the side for now. Let's once again begin with the Retroid Pocket 5. And here we're only getting around 20 frames per second, falling down to around 14 in the city as we drive around, smash up some cars. We're getting around 16 frames per second. I have seen people get better than this with tinkering and changing some of the settings, but this is one of those games that might make you tempted to upgrade your handheld, because we are getting, around 20 frames per second. So let's see what kind of performance we can get with the upgraded version of the Retroid Pocket 5, the Retroid Pocket G2. Here we are getting well over 40 frames per second, nice and easy. When we get to the more secluded areas, we're actually getting close to 60 frames per second. But even in the busy city like this with cars driving all over the place, we're getting close to, if not above, 40 frames per second, which feels nice and smooth. A noticeable upgrade over the Retroid Pocket 5, which is why I think if you really want a handheld before Christmas time, I think this is a good pickup. We know the Retroid Pocket 6 is coming soon, and if you can wait for that, then wait for the Retroid Pocket 6. But if you do want something for Christmas this year, I think the Retroid Pocket G2 is a lovely handheld. Here we're averaging around 44 frames per second. A great showing here for the G2. Now the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 in the Odin 2 portal here is getting a very similar frame per second, a little bit high, around 47, getting up into the 50s, so yes, a little bit higher than the Retroid Pocket G2. So if you can wait for the Retroid Pocket 6 that's coming around January time, definitely wait for that if you can. I would say we're averaging around 52 frames per second here. Once again, a really nice performance, and it just feels great driving around the city like this. The G3 Gen 3 and the Konkr Pocket Fit here is getting almost a locked on 60 frames per second. It was actually so close to 60 so much of the time, I had to go through the menu and check that I don't have VSync enabled, and I definitely don't. So once again, getting somewhere in the 50s, usually around 60, although now as I talk, it seems to be settling more around 56, 57, and pretty nice and smooth overall. On the Steam Deck, I unfortunately am in a different part of the game. That's just, that's how it goes, trying to synchronize all these things up together. But once again, as we drive around through a busy city and try not to get smashed by a truck, we're getting around 80 frames per second, falling down into the 70s here and there. But I would say we're averaging somewhere between around 73 and 78. Let's say on average here, around 76 frames per second. So nicely above 60, feeling nice and smooth, like pretty much every game on the Steam Deck does. Next up, we have Skyrim, and it seems like I have VSync enabled, so everything's going to be capped at 60 frames per second here. But anyway, not everything can even reach 60 frames per second, so let's just see how close they can get. First, we have the Snapdragon 865, which is showing some flashing and glitching textures here, and the frame per second is around 26. If we give the guard a cheeky little slap in the face, yeah, we're getting around 25 frames per second here. Let's see how much of an improvement the G2 Gen 2 is, and oh, take that. Sorry, Hildy. We're getting what looks like around 35 to 40 frames per second, around 36 overall. The Odin 2 Portal with its Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 feels nice and fluid with a 54 frame per second, very nice. Falling down to the mid 40s when in battle, but yeah, overall around mid 50s. I would say 57 is a nice average here. Feeling super smooth and makes me very excited for the Retroid Pocket 6. Are you okay, sir? Very similar story here with the G3 Gen 3, about 58 frames per second, a super smooth looking frame graph, except when we're fighting. We are falling down into the 30s and 40s here and there, but I think for the most part, you're going to be looking somewhere in the 50s. Overall, the frame rate looks to be around 57 or 58 frames per second. The 8 Elite feels like it's getting pretty hot now and is dropping down in frame rate to the 40s, unfortunately. Yeah, it's really not running very well here. I really think we need a handheld with dedicated cooling to test this out with, because it feels like it's just throttling. Once again, I'm unfortunately in a different area here on my Steam Deck, but you will see the frame rate basically stay at a solid 60. Even when we have some little fisticuffs with this bear, the frame rate's going to stay around 60. Very solid as usual for the Steam Deck. Our next game is Need for Speed Rivals, which unfortunately just crashed on my Retroid Pocket 5, but we'll try it on the others. So let's begin instead with the Retroid Pocket G2. And this game seems to be locked at 30 frames per second. I've had a look through the settings and I cannot see where I can disable that. So let's just see if we get a solid frame rate. It seems like we are. You can see that frame graph is basically just a straight line at this point, so the frame rate seems to be ticking along quite nicely. Let's see what happens if we maybe crash into another car. It still seems to be staying pretty solid at 30 frames per second. Very nice. As a little comparison, here is the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, which is going to be in the Retroid Pocket 6 on the Odin 2 Portal here, and if the G2 Gen 2 stays at 30 frames per second, I would expect this to stay at 30 frames per second too, and it certainly does seem to be doing that. So once again, very nice performance. I'm spinning the camera, trying to make it somehow slow down, but no, a beautiful, solid frame rate here. And with those hitting 30 frames per second, I have no doubt whatsoever the superpower G3 Gen 3 is going to be hitting it as well. This chip is an absolute beast. And yes, once again, we just have a straight line here when it comes to the frame graph. It's running very nicely. Unsurprisingly, it's actually the Snapdragon 8 Elite that's falling down in performance because it's just, I assume, thermal throttling. We're only getting around 14 frames per second here. I would love to see someone who has a review unit of the Odin 3 or the Konkr Pocket Fit put together something like this with the same games, and maybe you can share your findings, and we can see how the Elite can really do when it's not being confined to a phone form factor like this. And of course, if all those other devices are easily hitting 30 frames per second, there's no way the Steam Deck is going to lose any frames here. Once again, you can look at the frame graph at the top left of the screen, and it's just a solid line, an extremely easy 30 frames per second here. I am curious if we can raise the frame rate of this game to 60, but honestly, this game just looked really nice at 30. It's quite a cinematic game, and it just seems to suit the frame rate. Now let's get into our big, heavy hitting games. First, starting with Cyberpunk 2077. The Retroid Pocket 5 did show me 10 frames per second, but then when I tried to press the start button to get into the start menu, it seems to have unfortunately crashed. The Snapdragon 8 Elite, by the way, is still actually loading. The others all loaded ages ago, but we'll let that chug along and see if it can get into the game while we test the others. And I'm going to let this just cool down a bit and load up and see if we can get into the game. So let's now move on to the Snapdragon G2 Gen 2. Oh, the Retroid Pocket 5 has just officially crashed. We're just at the beginning of the game here, driving around, and we're getting a solid 10 frames per second. Now this is a really difficult game to run on something like this, so the fact that we're even running this at all is honestly impressive to me. I am impressed that we are running this. Let's just drive through the desert a bit, throw the car around, and yeah, the frame rate is very solid. I mean, it's quite low. It's about 13 frames per second, but you know, it's running. We are playing Cyberpunk on this tiny little handheld. I mean, that is really impressive to me. But yes, I'd say the average frame rate here is around 11 frames per second. Certainly not doing the best here. Let's see how the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 and the Odin 2 Portal compares. Here we seem to be, again, getting around 13 frames per second, getting up to around 15 or 16 in some areas. Overall, the frame rate does seem to be around 15 frames per second. That's the number I keep seeing often. So yeah, a little bit better than the Snapdragon G2 Gen 2. But I think for all intents and purposes, if one game is playable on one of these devices, it's probably going to be playable or unplayable on both. They are very close to each other. But yeah, the 8 Gen 2 is just a little bit better. Here on the G3 Gen 3 now, on the Konkr Pocket Fit, we have basically the same story again. Once again, we have around 15, 16 frames per second. It's climbing up to around 17, but I would say this is about exactly in line with the 8 Gen 2 at around 16 frames per second. So not really a big advantage here for the G3 Gen 3. On the Steam Deck, this is one of those games you're going to want to cap at around 30 frames per second, and you should be able to get a pretty solid 30 frames per second. For all of the games in today's test, I haven't changed any of the in-game settings up until now, except for turning off things like VSync so we can unlock the frame rate. But for this game and the next one, I did turn all the settings down to low on the Android handhelds. I also turned off things like motion blur as well, which might help with the frame rate a little bit. Here on the Steam Deck, we actually have a specific Steam Deck setting for the graphics, which is one of the reasons why the Steam Deck is such a great console to pick up if you don't have one. It is just easy mode for playing Steam games. And here we are at a pretty solid 30 frames per second with the Steam Deck preset, and it looks really, really nice, running much better than any of the Android handhelds, but of course you do get the worse battery life and the much bigger build. So you do have to juggle those things around and think about what you want out of a handheld, but certainly I can recommend the Steam Deck as a great handheld. The Snapdragon 8 Elite is still trying to load, and all right on cue has just gotten into the game. Here we are getting around 7 frames per second with things flickering in and out all over the place. It is just an absolute massive mess and reminds me of playing Switch on the Snapdragon 8 Elite. For anyone out there who has an Odin 3, please let me know in the comments below what your experience is with GameHub on these devices. I would love to know how it differs to just simply a phone with passive cooling. Here we are in Elden Ring, probably the most intensive game I've ever tried to run on these handhelds. Here on the Snapdragon 865, right at the beginning of the game here, we're getting around 13 frames per second. So I wouldn't exactly call this super playable, but we are in Elden Ring on the little Snapdragon 865, Retroid Pocket 5. I think that's pretty amazing. Even if it's not particularly going to be a playable experience, just the fact we're in here, I think's pretty great. But yeah, we're now falling down to around 8 frames per second, and I would say actually our average frame per second here is about 11. Moving up to the Retroid Pocket G2, in some ways the successor to the Retroid Pocket 5. Here we're at around 15 or 16 frames per second, so clearly an improvement here. And where the Retroid Pocket 5 fell down to around 6, here we're only falling down to around 12 or so. And I would say, yeah, the overall average frame rate here probably is around 15. Let's see how the 8 Gen 2 compares in the Odin 2 Portal. And here we're actually in the 20s. 20 frames per second, running not too bad here. So I actually think we can make our way over to the first little boss at the start of the game. As we are getting around 20 frames per second, we might be able to actually have a little fight. Falling down to around 16 here now, still better than the other handhelds so far at their best. So where is our pal? Here he is. Hello, pal. The frame rate here around 17 to 19 frames per second, not too bad. Okay, I'm sorry, God. The Snapdragon 8 Elite at this point just seems to need a rest. I don't think it can handle this anymore, and I'm starting to worry that my phone might actually fry itself. We're only getting 4 frames per second. It just really goes to show that if you have a Snapdragon 8 Elite, you need some elite cooling for it. We have seen some complaints of whining sounds and fan problems with the Odin 3. You are going to need a beefy cooler if you want to use the Elite, because you can see my phone just can't handle this anymore. It's down to 5 frames per second. So that is one thing to be wary of if you are ordering an Odin 3 or a Konkr Pocket Fit with the Elite chip, is going to need some pretty good cooling. So let's now check out the G3 Gen 3, which does have excellent cooling, an excellent fan, and the G3 Gen 3 seems to run a little bit cooler than the 8 Elite. And here we are getting 33 frames per second. Now, as we get more into the dense wooded area of the game, it is falling down to around 25 or so. Let's see how many frames we get when we run up to the boss. The exciting thing is that the Elite version of this should actually get a higher frame rate if this cooling is sufficient. So whatever you're seeing here with the G3 Gen 3 is really impressive. The 8 Elite could potentially get even more than this, which is really exciting, and I really hope to get my hand on an Elite soon. And just as I was saying how great this was, it's died. On the Steam Deck, we're getting a solid frame rate in the 40s. It feels lovely and smooth. Once again, if you wanted to, you could lock the screen refresh rate down to 40 frames per second, which would make it feel super responsive. And yes, Elden Ring is yet another game that just runs beautifully on the Steam Deck, like pretty much any game, to be honest. The only game I know that doesn't really run on the Steam Deck is something like League of Legends that requires Windows. But because of that, I just dual-booted Windows on my Steam Deck, so I've got the best of all worlds. See, I don't want to be one of those guys, but seriously, just buy a Steam Deck if that's what you're looking for, because it is just excellent. And now, just as a kind of final thing before we shuttle this down and give our final thoughts, why don't we see what the temperature of these devices really actually is using a thermal imaging camera inside my Retroid Pocket Classic. Here we can see the temperature of the devices on the screen. Annoyingly, everything is flipped around because all of these screens in these Android devices are actually portrait screens from phones, which have been flipped using firmware to make them horizontal. So I'm going to show this actual video on the screen now, and we'll run through the temperatures of all the devices. So let's begin with the Retroid Pocket 5 here. You can see the hotspot there is 42 degrees, a little bit toasty. Moving on to the Retroid Pocket G2 here, 47 degrees, a fair bit hotter. The Odin 2 Portal is also running at around 47 degrees as well. A little bit cooler than the Retroid Pocket G2, maybe not surprising because it is a bigger, beefier device, with I expect a bigger, beefier fan and kind of the same level of chip. The Konkr Pocket Fit here is running cooler at 42 degrees, which is interesting because it's quite a bit more powerful than the previous two devices, so the cooling seems to definitely be working quite nicely there. The Samsung Fold 7 here is running much cooler, 37 degrees being the hottest part, and that's the cable going into the cooler. And the hottest part of the Steam Deck is 44 degrees, so they're all in a similar ballpark. Let me now just flip the devices over just to see if they get any hotter on the back. The hottest point of the Retroid Pocket 5 at the back is 44 degrees. The Retroid Pocket G2 is 51 degrees, quite toasty. The Odin 2 Portal on the back is only 39 degrees, keeping nice and cool. Similarly, the Konkr Pocket Fit is only about 40 degrees on the back as well, also doing a good job of dissipating that heat. The Samsung Fold 7 is 42 degrees, so quite warm, but not anything crazy. And the Steam Deck is 55 degrees on the back. That is a hot boy. So that was 12 games tested on 6 devices using GameHub and a Steam Deck. What did you think? Please let me know in the comments below. This video took a lot of effort. It took me a whole week, countless hours to put this together. As I said before, I changed more than 300 settings on these devices, and then even more throughout the course of this video. So please give me a like and subscribe if you didn't already. Share it with anyone who might be interested, as I did put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this. So I really hope it was helpful. If you would like to help support me to replace my phone with a dedicated Snapdragon 8 Elite device for future shootouts, please check out the Throne link in the description, where like the other lovely people who made kind donations, you can help me make that a reality. Also, of course, thank you so much to all my patrons who continue to support me and my website. If you'd like to become a patron, that'll also be in the description as well. And of course, if you would hate to do any of those things and don't want to, no worries whatsoever. There's no pressure at all. I just hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next, hopefully easier to make video. Bye.